Between 1400 and 1500 A, approximately 500 Norse colonists vanished from Greenland's eastern settlement without leaving bodies, mass graves, or documentation of departure. Archaeological excavations have recovered intact buildings, preserved food stores, livestock bones indicating maintained herds, and written records detailing daily administrative activities dated to within decades of the disappearance. No evidence of plague, famine, military conflict, or voluntary evacuation has been identified. The settlement had survived continuous habitation for 450 years across some of the harshest environmental conditions in the medieval world. Then every occupant disappeared within a single generation, leaving behind infrastructure that suggested they expected to return. The Norse colonization of Greenland began in 985 AD, when Eric the Red led 14 ships, carrying approximately 400 settlers from Iceland. The expedition established two primary settlements. The Eastern Settlement, despite its name, occupied Greenland's southwestern coast near present-day Qeqertaq. The Western Settlement sat approximately 300 miles north. Both locations provided access to fjords that remained ice-free during summer months, enabling maritime transportation and contact with Norway and Iceland. The Eastern Settlement grew to approximately 500 farms by 1300 AD. Archaeological surveys have identified 190 documented farmsteads, 16 churches, and 2 monasteries. The settlement supported a bishop who maintained communication with Rome. Church records from the Vatican archives document tithes paid by Greenland Norse communities as late as 1410 AD. These payments arrived in the form of walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and narwhal tusks, confirming active maritime trade routes connecting Greenland to European markets. The colonists developed specialized adaptations to Arctic conditions. They constructed turf and stone buildings with thick walls for insulation. They maintained herds of cattle, sheep, and goats adapted to short growing seasons. They supplemented farming with hunting seal, caribou, and seabirds. Excavated midden heaps show dietary composition evolved over centuries, with marine resources comprising an increasing percentage of consumed calories as climate conditions changed. The medieval warm period, approximately 950 to 1250 AD, provided relatively mild temperatures that enabled agricultural expansion across northern latitudes. Greenland's Norse settlements benefited from this climatic window. Growing seasons extended sufficiently to produce hay for livestock winter feed. However, ice core data from Greenland's interior ice sheet documents a cooling trend beginning around 1300 AD. This marked the onset of the Little Ice Age, which persisted until approximately 1850 AD. The Western settlement disappeared first. Archaeological evidence indicates abandonment occurred around 1350 AD. Excavations at Western settlement sites have found no human remains, no indicators of violence, and no evidence of hasty departure. Buildings remained structurally intact. Tools sat in storage areas. In some locations, archaeologists recovered livestock bones from animals that had been confined in barns and apparently left to perish when no humans remained to provide care. A 1355 AD written account by Ivar Bardarson, a Norwegian priest who traveled to Greenland, describes finding the Western settlement completely deserted. Bardarson documented entering homes and churches that showed no signs of conflict or disorder. Personal possessions remained in place. He reported taking livestock that had apparently gone feral and were roaming the abandoned farmsteads. Bardarson's account provided no explanation for the disappearance, and noted that even the indigenous Inuit populations he encountered possessed no information about what happened to the Norse inhabitants. The Eastern settlement persisted for approximately 150 years after the Western settlement's abandonment. Church records confirm that bishops continued to serve the Eastern settlement through the late 1300s. The last recorded bishop, Alf, was documented in Rome in 1378 AD, seeking confirmation for his appointment. Vatican archives show correspondence addressed to Greenland church authorities as late as 1408 AD. The final documented contact between Greenland and Europe occurred in 1410 AD, when a ship arrived in Norway carrying the last recorded payment of church tithes from the eastern settlement. After 1410 AD, no ships from Greenland reached European ports. No correspondence arrived. By 1450 AD, when European vessels finally returned to Greenland's coast, they found the eastern settlement abandoned. A first comprehensive archaeological investigation of the eastern settlement occurred in the early 1900s. Danish archaeologists excavated numerous farmsteads and documented consistent patterns. Buildings showed no fire damage, no structural collapse from neglect, and no evidence of military assault. In many locations, researchers found complete sets of household items. Iron tools, which represented significant economic value due to the scarcity of workable iron in Greenland, remained in storage. Wooden furniture sat in place. Textile fragments indicated woven goods had been left in storage chests. One of the most significant discoveries came from the excavation of a churchyard at Herjolfsens, one of the eastern settlement's primary communities. Archaeologists recovered approximately 500 burials. The bodies showed preservation due to permafrost conditions. Analysis of the remains provided critical data about the population's final decades. Skeletal examinations revealed evidence of nutritional stress. Bone density measurements indicated declining calcium intake. Dental analysis showed reduced consumption of agricultural products. However, the bodies showed no indicators of acute starvation, epidemic disease, or violent trauma. The clothing recovered from Herjolfsens burials demonstrated continued European fashion trends. Bodies interred in the late 1400s wore garments that matched contemporary European styles, including high-crowned hats and fitted jackets. This indicated either maintained trade contact with Europe or access to European goods through intermediary sources well into the 1400s. The presence of fashionable European clothing contradicted theories of complete isolation. Isotopic analysis of bones and teeth from the Herjolfsens remains provided data on dietary composition across multiple generations. Earlier burials showed mixed agricultural and marine diets. Later burials indicated marine resources comprised over 80% of consumed calories. This shift suggested declining agricultural productivity, but confirmed the population maintained access to food sources. The marine diet emphasis matched patterns observed in successful Arctic hunting cultures and should have provided adequate nutrition. Climate proxy data from ice cores and sediment analysis confirms temperatures declined significantly during the young 1400s. Growing seasons shortened. Sea ice extent increased, limiting navigation windows. However, the indigenous Thule people, ancestors of modern Greenland Inuit, thrived during this same period using marine hunting strategies. Archaeological evidence shows Thule populations expanded across Greenland throughout the 1300s and 1400s. The environmental conditions that apparently contributed to Norse decline simultaneously supported population growth among groups employing different subsistence strategies. Some researchers have proposed that declining contact with Europe eliminated access to essential trade goods, particularly iron for tools and weapons. However, excavations consistently recover iron implements in abandoned Norse sites. The Norse also possessed knowledge of bog iron extraction, a technique for producing iron from iron-rich wetland deposits. Archaeological evidence confirms they employed this method in Greenland. While European iron was superior in quality, the complete absence of iron cannot explain abandonment. Alternative theories suggest conflict with expanding Thule populations forced Norse evacuation. This scenario encounters multiple evidentiary problems. First, no Norse settlements show archaeological indicators of military assault. Second, Thule material culture appears in some Norse archaeological contexts, suggesting trade or peaceful interaction rather than exclusively hostile relations. Third, Norse technology included weapons and defensive architecture. A population of 500 possessing iron tools, knowledge of fortification construction, and established defensive positions would be extremely difficult to eliminate without leaving archaeological traces. Some historians have proposed mass evacuation by ship. This theory suggests the entire population departed Greenland voluntarily, possibly returning to Iceland or Norway. However, this scenario requires addressing significant logical obstacles. First, constructing sufficient vessels to transport 500 people plus essential supplies would require extensive shipbuilding activity. Norse Greenland had limited timber resources. Large-scale ship construction would have left archaeological evidence in the form of shipyards, tool assemblages, and wood waste. No such evidence has been identified. Second, a planned mass evacuation would involve systematic dismantling of valuable infrastructure. Iron fittings would be removed from buildings. Church bells, altar vessels, and religious artifacts would be packed for transport. Families would prioritize high-value portable goods. Instead, archaeological evidence shows materials left in place as though inhabitants expected to return or departed with minimal preparation time. Third, if 500 people arrived in Iceland or Norway during the 1400s, contemporary records would document this event. Iceland maintained detailed administrative records. A sudden influx of hundreds of refugees would appear in church registers, land transfer documents, or legal proceedings. No such records exist. Norwegian and Icelandic archives contain no references to mass arrival of Greenland Norse during the relevant period. A 2012 study published in the Journal of the North Atlantic proposed a gradual abandonment model. This theory suggests the population declined through a combination of factors including reduced birth rates, increased mortality, and small-scale immigration over several generations. The final remaining inhabitants, possibly fewer than 50 people, either departed on a single vessel or perished from causes that left no archaeological trace. This model addresses some evidentiary gaps, but creates new questions. Gradual population decline should produce documentary evidence. Church records should note declining congregation sizes, reduced tithe payments, or requests for assistance. Instead, tithe payments from the 1400s arrive in amounts consistent with earlier periods, suggesting maintained population levels, or at minimum maintained economic productivity. Environmental DNA analysis of lake sediment cores near Norse farmsteads provides another data source. These studies detect genetic material from livestock, crops, and human waste that accumulates in aquatic environments. The sediment cores show sustained signals consistent with Norse farming activity through the 1300s and into the early 1400s. Then the agricultural indicators decline rapidly rather than gradually. This pattern suggests relatively sudden abandonment rather than slow population decrease over multiple generations. One detail frequently overlooked in popular accounts involves the discovery of a 1448 AD written record. This document, held in Iceland's National Archives, references a marriage that occurred in Greenland's eastern settlement. The record states the ceremony took place at Volsi Church, one of the settlement's primary religious buildings. The document was witnessed and later transported to Iceland. This confirms human presence in the eastern settlement at least until 1448 AD, considerably later than many historical accounts acknowledge. The gap between 1448 AD and the discovery of abandoned settlements in the mid-1400s narrows to perhaps a single decade or even less. This compressed timeline intensifies the mystery. A viable community conducting marriages in 1448 AD disappears completely within years, leaving no bodies, no mass graves, and no written explanation. Researchers have investigated whether epidemic disease could explain rapid depopulation. The Black Death, which reached Iceland in 1402 AD, killed an estimated 60% of Iceland's population. However, No documentary evidence confirms plague reached Greenland. Additionally, plague victims require burial. The disease produces characteristic skeletal lesions in some cases. Greenland's permafrost conditions preserve organic remains exceptionally well. Mass plague graves should be archaeologically visible. None have been found. Another disease theory focuses on trichinosis, a parasitic infection contracted from undercooked meat. Norse populations consuming seal and walrus meat faced trichinosis risk. However, trichinosis typically affects individuals or small groups rather than entire populations simultaneously. It does not explain coordinated abandonment of an entire settlement. The economic collapse theory proposes that declining European demand for Greenland export goods eliminated the settlement's trade viability. Walrus ivory, the primary export commodity, faced competition from African elephant ivory as Portuguese explorers established trade routes along Africa's coast in the 1400s. Reduced ivory prices could have made Greenland trade unprofitable. However, the Norse settlements practiced mixed subsistence economies. They produced their own food, fuel, and basic materials. Economic isolation might reduce quality of life, but should not necessitate complete abandonment. Some researchers note that maintenance of European cultural identity despite environmental challenges may have contributed to vulnerability. The Norse population maintained European dress, Christian religious practices, and agricultural emphasis, even as conditions favored marine hunting adaptations. The Thule people employed skin boats, toggling harpoons, and specialized seal hunting techniques that enabled them to thrive in identical environmental conditions. The Norse possessed knowledge of these technologies through contact with indigenous populations, but apparently chose not to adopt them systematically. This cultural conservatism theory suggests the Norse population faced a choice between maintaining European identity and optimizing survival strategies for Arctic conditions. Their commitment to European Christian cultural norms may have limited adaptive flexibility when environmental conditions shifted. However, this explanation addresses why the culture became vulnerable, not what specific event or sequence triggered complete abandonment. The most recent archaeological work has focused on a site called Gus, a farm beneath the sand. This eastern settlement farmstead became buried under blown sand. Sometime in the 1400s, the sand coverage created anaerobic conditions that preserved organic materials with exceptional fidelity. Excavations recovered intact textiles, wooden implements, and even preserved insects. Analysis of these materials confirms the farm was actively occupied into the mid-1400s. Then abandonment occurred rapidly. Hay remained stored in the barn. Tools sat in workshops. The preservation suggests occupants departed intending to return, but never did. Current archaeological consensus holds that the Greenland Norse disappearance resulted from multiple interacting factors rather than a single catastrophic event. Climate cooling reduced agricultural viability. Cultural conservatism limited adoption of alternative subsistence strategies. Declining European contact reduced trade opportunities and possibly immigration that would replenish population. The combination of stresses accumulated until the community reached a tipping point where continued habitation became unsustainable. Yet this multi-factor explanation still does not account for the absence of bodies. Even if the final population was small and departed by ship, some individuals would have been too elderly, too young, or too ill to travel. Some would have chosen to remain. Greenland's environment preserves human remains for centuries. The eastern settlement covers a large geographic area with numerous potential burial or habitation sites that remain unexplored due to Greenland's vast scale and limited archaeological resources. The Norse Greenland settlements represent one of history's most extensively documented disappearances. We possess written records from the settlement's establishment, detailed accounts of daily life across 4 centuries, documentation of trade with Europe, and physical evidence of their infrastructure and possessions. We can trace their dietary changes, their clothing evolution, and their skeletal health across generations. We know they were present in 1448 AD, conducting normal community activities. Within years, possibly within months, 500 people vanished, leaving behind everything that should have been valuable enough to take or bury with deceased community members. Given that the settlement maintained sufficient organization to conduct formal marriages in 1448 AD, that buildings and stored goods showed no evidence of emergency abandonment, that climate conditions, while challenging, were being successfully navigated by Tuli populations in identical environments, and that no mass graves or epidemic indicators have been identified despite extensive excavation and optimal preservation. Conditions: what scenario accounts for complete population disappearance within approximately 1 decade while leaving infrastructure intact and creating zero archaeological evidence of the departure method or final destination?